Thank you for being here, for joining us tonight for this conversation about carbon pricing, sponsored by the League of Women Voters of La Plata County. My name is Trish Pegram. I'm a member of the board of the League, and I'm so happy to see you all here. First, I want to make a couple of comments about logistics for tonight. As you came in, there were League members offering you note cards to put your names on if you might want to ask a question. At the end. We know that right now you don't probably even know if you have a question, but if you have any thought that you might want to ask something, put your name on a card, get it into one of our baskets, and we're going to randomly draw a name and ask a few people to come down to ask their question. If you still don't have a question and your name gets drawn, just say thank you. Everybody's already answered my question, and we'll go to the next person. If there's no card, you don't have a chance, so put your name on a card and put it in the basket just in case. Second thing, we'll be passing clipboards around with paper. We'll ask you if you are interested in having information sent to you by the League of Women Voters about our upcoming events. We'd appreciate your putting your email address on one of those clipboards that comes around. We won't use your name for anything. We won't give your email address. We won't give it to anybody else. But we do have some interesting events coming up over this winter, and we would like to be able to get in touch with you and let you know about it. For one thing, coming up fairly soon on October 30, we're going to be hosting a presentation by Carol Hedges, who is the executive director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute. She's going to be explaining the Gallagher Act and Tabor and their impact on Colorado finances. She may be one of the few people in the state who understands that stuff. So it could be a really good thing to come listen to her. And if we have your email address, we'll send you information about that, full information, and also other events we have planned for the winter. And now, as part of the introduction to tonight, I want to give you a few comments about the League of Women Voters and why we're interested in the topic for tonight. The League is totally nonpartisan. We never support or oppose any candidate or any party, but we are political, and we do support ideas, and we do support or oppose policies. One of the issues on which we have long been involved is protecting our air quality. League members across the country actively campaign against climate change by supporting controls on carbon pollution. We believe a price on carbon will put the market to work to decrease demand for fossil fuels and make alternatives more affordable. We support carbon pricing in the form of either a carbon tax or fee or cap and trade. We encourage our legislators at both federal and state levels to seriously consider carbon pricing options and to begin a bipartisan, inclusive debate on each plan's merits. We hope the program tonight will help you better understand both possibilities and encourage you to become involved in the issue with us. Now I want to introduce our League member who will be moderating the program tonight, Steve Ruddle, which, by the way, is also a reminder that the League of Women Voters is not for women only. It hasn't been for a long time. We welcome any of you guys who want to join us. Steve has been actively involved in carbon emission work for several years and was instrumental in putting this evening together. So thanks for that, and welcome.
Thank you, Trish. Just so everybody knows, the basket of names is up here. So that'll be what we draw from, kind of at random. Just so you know what kind of follow up on what Trish said. For decades, economists have advocated the use of market-based mechanisms as an effective means for reducing emission of harmful air pollutants like carbon dioxide, which while maintaining a healthy economy. There are now examples of how to use two market-based mechanisms that are working now to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, carbon taxes, and cap and trade. Many policymakers believe that these market-based approaches hold the greatest promise for allowing us to make a smooth transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and other zero-carbon technologies. So why are we having this discussion? From a policy perspective, it would be best to have a comprehensive national strategy to reduce carbon emissions in the United States. But we don't have that. And the previous administration's climate action plan included policies that are now being overturned, including the Clean Power Plan and emissions reduction trading program. With a lack of federal leadership under our current administration, much of the work on carbon emissions policy will shift to state governments. And there is a lot that states and even local governments and the private sector can do to make progress in the coming years. Tonight, we're going to focus on the role that carbon pricing strategies can play, with a focus on what's possible in Colorado. While these two policy mechanisms share a common objective, that is reducing carbon emissions, they have some fundamental differences. Cap and trade reduces CO2 emissions by a government setting the CO2 emission quantity, also called the cap, and letting emission trading markets set the price. Carbon taxes reduce CO2 emission by a government setting the price on fossil fuels and letting people make purchasing decisions that stimulate demand for more efficient products, which could establish, or which would establish, the attained emission quantity. I'm going to say that again, a little bit simpler. Cap and trade, the emissions level is fixed, and markets determine the price. For a carbon tax, the price is fixed, and markets determine the emissions level that is attained. With us this evening, we have two national experts on these two emission reduction policy mechanisms. Yoram Bauman makes a living as a stand-up economist. He's a comedian. Whoever thought an economist could be funny? Being an economist myself, I don't have a funny bone in my body. And so Yoram was the founder and the co-chair of Carbon Washington campaign, which placed the first ever carbon tax measure on the ballot in the United States in the state of Washington last November. Yoram is an active author in economics and climate change and helped inspire the revenue-neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. Yoram has a mathematics degree from Reed College in Portland and a PhD in economics from the University of Washington. Patrick Cummins is a La Plata County resident and Fort Lewis College graduate who works for former Governor Bill Ritter at the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, where he leads the center's work with Western states, utilities, and stakeholders on the transition to low-carbon economy, including the Clean Power Plan. Patrick has been working with Western states and stakeholders on air quality and climate programs for 30 years, including at Metro Denver's Regional Air Quality Council as the Director of Air Quality and Climate Programs at the Western Governors Association. Prior to joining Governor Ritter at Colorado State, he served as the Executive Director of the Western Climate Initiative, where he helped design and implement the world's first economy-wide cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions, which has been implemented by the state of California and the Canadian provinces of Quebec and Ontario. Patrick has a chemistry degree from Fort Lewis College and a master's degree in environmental policy from Indiana University. So here's how we're going to proceed. First, Patrick, then Yoram will make presentations of 20 minutes each, and I'm going to hold them to that. When you see me stand, it means they're done. And they know that, so sorry, Andrew, when I stand, I'm going to be right there. I'll be right, I'll be right in front of you. We'll see how disciplined they are with sticking to 20 minutes. Since we know the devil is in the detail, we'll have a 20-minute panel discussion up here with Patrick and Yoram to kind of flesh out some of the details between these two policy mechanisms, with a focus again on what's possible in Colorado. Then we're going to open it up from questions from you. And this represents kind of the people that said they thought they might want to ask a question. So we'll randomly select names, and I'm going to ask those people when it's time to queue up, and it's going to be at the mic that was at the middle of the stairs there. I'll be putting a mic in the stand there, so queue up behind that. And we'll get as many questions as we can. But at no later than 8:30, we're going to begin to wind down. So if your name is called, queue up. But what's important is that when it's your turn, I want you to state your name. And you're going to be given 15 seconds to ask a question. We expect a lot of people to want to ask questions. And so there won't be a lot of commentary or introductory statements. Just ask a question. Patrick and Yoram have agreed to stick around after we are done until about 9 o'clock when Fort Lewis College says that they will close the doors, so it'll be best to be on that side, if you don't mind. So before we get started, let me just make one last comment or two. This is a very complex area of climate policy. You may at times feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose when you're at this kind of beginning trying to understand these. So a takeaway I think I can guarantee is that you're going to leave this evening with more questions than answers. But hopefully we're going to all leave with a better understanding of how we can make progress and initiate action on this important issue. So let's get started. Patrick.
Thank you, Steve, for everything you've done to put this together, and thank you to the League for sponsoring it, and thank you to all of you for showing up here tonight. It's nice to see so many people interested in this topic. I have a great 45-minute presentation here, and as you heard, I don't have 45 minutes, so I'm going to dive right in and talk really fast. So let's see. First, I have to figure out the clicker. Okay, so I always like to start with this chart because it shows the success that we've had in the United States when it comes to reducing air pollution under the Clean Air Act, really since the start of the modern environmental movement in the 1970s. Since that time, we have reduced emissions of the 6 primary pollutants that are regulated for their impact on public health by almost 75%. Even as, obviously, the country has grown significantly, population, vehicle miles traveled, and gross domestic product have all increased substantially. And yet we have had great success in reducing emissions. When we look at carbon dioxide, which we're concerned with here for climate change, we can see that the story is not so good. Up until about 10 years ago, emissions were increasing, and while those emissions are now trending down, really the challenge that we face over the coming decades is to figure out how to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, as we have successfully done with other air pollution problems. The reason that we're here tonight talking about cap and trade and carbon tax is that unlike these other pollutants that we were able to control with scrubbers on power plants or catalytic converters on our cars, we really have no technology available to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions when we burn coal, oil, and natural gas. And really the only way to do that is to reduce consumption and transition to clean and renewable energy. Making this kind of change to our current energy system is going to require, in my opinion, a dramatic shift in public policy. There's a lot of good things happening with technology and in the market, but we're not getting there nearly quick enough without a change in public policy. And both carbon tax and cap and trade are public policies or strategies that I think can play an important role in this transition. Okay, so how are we doing on greenhouse gas emissions so far? So what this is EPA data from 2005 to 2015 showing greenhouse gas emissions by the major sectors: electricity generation, transportation, so that's vehicles, industrial, ag, commercial, and residential. This commercial and residential is really the propane and natural gas that we burn in our homes. What we can see overall is that total emissions have declined from 2005 to 2015 by about 10%. The vast majority of that has come out of the electricity sector as we have seen a transition from more polluting coal to cleaner sources of energy. This is 2015. In 2016, we know that electricity continued down. Transportation actually ticked up. And so transportation is now the largest source of emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the United States. The other part here, and that really represents, I think, one of our biggest challenges, is how we reduce emissions from the transportation sector. The other piece is that while we expect things to continue down, especially in the electricity sector, the projections are not that we would get to the levels that the U.S. committed to in the Paris Climate Agreement, which is 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. We're going to continue to make some progress, but we're not going to get there. And we're certainly not going to get there. We have less chance of getting there given that many of the programs like the Clean Power Plan and other elements of the last administration's Climate Action Plan are now being reversed. Okay, so how do we get there? This is the ABCs, or the 1, 2, 3, in my view, of how we get to a low-carbon economy. And this is straight out of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. Deep decarbonization, that's another way of saying low-carbon economy. And it's really three things. The first, obviously, is energy efficiency and conservation. That always comes first. The second is to produce electricity from low or zero carbon sources, renewable energy primarily. And then other fuels, to the extent we're going to continue to burn liquid fuels, it's not going to be petroleum. It's going to have to be things like biofuels. And then switching our energy end uses to these zero and low carbon energy carriers. That's kind of jargon. What I'll tell you it means is we need to produce our electricity from renewable energy. That's going to include adding storage to the system. And the other really significant piece is the transportation sector and moving to electric vehicles. So because of that, because it's really all about, it's not 100% of the story, but it's 80 to 90% of the story, is ideally a zero carbon grid that is powering most of our energy end uses. The path to this low carbon economy really runs straight through the electricity grid. Okay? So we are here in Colorado, we are part of the Western grid. There are 3 grids in the United States: an Eastern grid, a Texas grid, and the Western grid that covers 11 Western states. So how have we been doing in terms of our electricity sources in the West in recent years? This has a lot of squiggly lines on it. Focus on the black one, that's coal, and on the green one, that's renewable energy. And what we have seen since 2008 is a significant decrease in coal generation. If you go back to the peak in 2005, we're generating 30% less electricity from coal on the Western grid now than we were in 2005. And over this time period, all of the reduction in generation from coal has been made up by increases in renewable generation. Wind has doubled since 2010. Solar has gone up 10 times since 2012 in just the last really 4 years, because this is 2016 data. So we do see this very positive trend in the electricity sector. And it's going to continue. This is a chart of Western coal plants. And I just told you that electricity generation from coal went down by 30% from 2005 to 2016. So here's 2016. Here's the remaining coal plants in black. There have been planned announcements for planned retirements of half of the remaining coal on the Western grid in the next 10 years. Okay, so if you go out here to 2027, these are the different states and tribes that have coal, and half of that capacity is planned for retirement in the next 10 years. And the other thing is this yellow slice is that the remaining coal on the system is already very old. So if you assume that it's going to retire when the plant gets to 50 years old, what you see is that over the next 20 years, virtually all the coal on the Western grid is going to retire. So that's good news. The real challenge that we face is ensuring that we replace that generation with clean power. And secondly, it's not that we just need to replace this retiring capacity. We need to generate a lot more electricity because we need to power a lot more things, especially our transportation system, with clean electricity. So this is the Western, this is for the 11 Western states as well, okay? And what this is carbon dioxide emissions from the various sectors. I told you that last year on a national level, transportation became the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. In the West, it's very different. In the West, transportation is already 1.5 times more than electricity today. And electricity, the electric sector is going down, okay? The transportation sector is flat to even increasing a little bit in recent years. So I'm kind of trying to hammer home this point that that's really our big challenge. All right, now I'm going to turn to cap and trade. You're like, I thought he was supposed to talk about cap and trade. It's a little complicated. Yoram said he was going to give me some of his time because my strategy is a lot more complicated to, so how much of that, he said like 8 minutes I could have? Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about cap and trade. And so as you heard in the introduction, I really was lucky enough to work on this project with a group of Western states and Canadian provinces from 2008 to 2015 to develop what became the world's first economy-wide cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the first cap and trade program. It's not the first cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions, but it is the only cap and trade program that not only covers power plants and industrial sources, but it also covers transportation and it covers residential and commercial fuels, natural gas and propane. This was led by California. So I'm going to sort of interchangeably talk about California and Ontario and Quebec and the Western Climate Initiative. That's all one thing. Why does California matter? Well, there you go. They're huge. California is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world if they were a country. And these are the other Western states. California, there's more emissions in California than the next 5 states combined. So it's a big deal. What they're doing is a big deal. Colorado's second on the list, and we were going to focus on Colorado a bit here tonight as well. So what did California do? How much time do I have, Steve?
9 minutes.
Whew. Okay. In 2006, California passed what they call the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And what that called for was the state to achieve 1990 levels of emissions by the year 2020. And that's what I'm showing here as phase 1 of the program, okay? The legislation did not direct the state to adopt a cap and trade program. It gave discretion to the state air regulator to decide how to achieve this target of 1990 levels by 2020, and they selected cap and trade. in July, the California State Legislature, on a 2/3 vote, which was very important because there's a lot of legal challenges to the program, that it was a tax, and that if it was a tax, it needed to be enacted by a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. Well, Jerry Brown was successful in getting the California State Legislature, including some Republicans, to extend the cap and trade program in California out to 2030 and to lower the cap to 40% below 1990 levels. So a 40% reduction in the cap in the next 12 years. This is a very aggressive and comprehensive program to address greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that's important to recognize when we talk about carbon tax and cap and trade, in my opinion, is that these things, they're not panaceas. They don't work all by themselves. California has a variety of other regulatory programs. There's a lot of jargon here, and I don't have time to explain it all. But the point is that whether it's for methane emissions or motor vehicle emissions or energy efficiency, their renewable energy standard, there's a lot of complementary programs that they rely on to achieve this reduction, okay? But they also rely on the cap. So this is what they're projecting for 2030, from 2021 to 2030, the next phase of the program, is that they're going to get a lot out of these other programs, but that the cap is going to force a piece of it as well. And there's uncertainty about what some of these other programs are going to achieve. And so the cap becomes, this is their uncertainty scenario, where they're saying, well, we might get as little of this, so we might need to rely on the cap to get us as much as half of the emissions that we need to reduce to hit the target. Okay, so there are some standard elements of a cap and trade program. What I really want to emphasize here is that cap and trade is at its heart an air pollution control program. It is a regulatory program that is implemented and enforced by state environmental agencies. So there's mandatory reporting. There are penalties for failure to comply. This is not a squishy thing. This is a very rigorously enforced and closely monitored program. And, we know that not everybody always plays by the rules. Volkswagen, well, how did that work out for them? So, we can rely to a significant degree on this kind of program. Then there are some sort of what I would say are discretionary elements, parts of a cap and trade program that a state or a country that adopts this has to decide. And the first is the scope. What's under the cap? What pollutants are under the cap? Under the California program, it's all 6 of the primary greenhouse gas emissions. What sources are under the cap? Is it just industrial sources? Is it industrial plus transportation? What's the cap? How stringent? By what year? And then how are the allowances going to be allocated? One of the, I think, sort of things that's frequently misunderstood and hard to explain about cap and trade is that the thing to remember is that the allowances, the permits that sources that are regulated under this program need are distributed by the state. You start with nothing, okay? If you're running an industrial facility or you're selling fuel, you start at zero. The state then is going to decide how to allocate these allowances, because every year there's only enough. The number of allowances equals the number of the cap for that year. Generally, they're distributed in 2 ways. There are some that are freely allocated to sources. There are some sources, I always like to use cement as an example. They refer to them as energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, where if you're running a cement plant in the state of California, the idea, I still got 5 minutes, that's awesome. If you're running a cement plant in the state of California, the goal of this program is not to run you off. It's not to chase you to Asia and then just have you send the bags of cement back. Okay, the idea is to transition these industries that they can't just flip a switch and stop producing emissions. The idea is to transition them over time. So they get some free allowances at the beginning. It's not a windfall. They can't go out and sell it and make bank off this deal. It's it's enough. It's usually 90% of what they emit. There's a benchmark for efficiency at how they should operate that's adjusted on an annual basis, and the number of free allowances goes down over time. Other sources have to buy allowances at auction. The state runs an auction and sells the allowances that sources need to comply with the program. That's where the price comes in, okay? And I don't know exactly the percentage in California right now, but it's probably more than half of the allowances are sold at auction because the fuel distributors, et cetera, they have to buy them, okay? The next big question, and maybe this is something that we'll get into more during the question and answer, is what to do with the auction revenue. Now, whether, like under a carbon tax, the state has generated a revenue source. In California, this is going to be, it's already been billions of dollars, maybe 10 billion to date. It's going to be tens of billions of dollars that they're going to take in between now and 2030 through this program. So what are they going to do with that? And this is a choice that you can make in the program. Is it revenue neutral, meaning do you reduce other taxes to offset this revenue source? Do you give a refund or a dividend to households and taxpayers? Do you invest that in energy efficiency and clean energy? Do you provide low-income energy assistance? Or do you just deposit it in the general fund? These are all options that you have. Okay, very quickly. This is where I start to burn into some of Yoram's time. Linking, okay? What linking means is that basically, and again, I'll use the example of California, Quebec, and Ontario. And Jerry Brown was just in Quebec City on Friday. Up till now, this program has been just California and Quebec. But on Friday, Ontario formally signed on. This has been coming for a long time. But this was the formal sign-on in Ontario. They were in Quebec City, Jerry Brown with the premiers of Ontario and Quebec. So now, what that means is that California, Quebec, and Ontario are linked. Every jurisdiction can only enforce in their jurisdiction with their existing authority. We're not going to let Quebec come into California or Colorado and start enforcing against our sources. But what they do, so they maintain their independent authority, but what they do is they say, we're going to put all the allowances into one pool, and we're going to sell them together, and if you buy an allowance out of that pool that happens to have been issued by the province of Quebec, but you're running a cement plant in California, you can use that allowance in California. That's what linking means, and the programs are harmonized to achieve that. There's a floor price, meaning there's a minimum price. If demand sags, there's still going to be a minimum price. And one of the things that the California legislature did when they extended the program out to 2040 and tightened it, we really don't know, as Steve said in his introduction, we really don't know what the price is going to be on carbon to get to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So the legislature dictated that the state has to put a ceiling on that price. And at that point, if it hits the price ceiling, that means that the state will sell allowances at that price that go above the cap. Okay? I'm not even going to talk about offsets. That is Steve's favorite topic. He's cutting me off. We're not going to talk about it. There are a number of existing cap and trade programs in existence right now. We've had one in the United States since 1990 with the acid rain program, and sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants in the U.S. have been reduced by 95% since that time. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, they really led the way in the United States with cap and trade. 9 states that have a program that just covers the electricity sector, just covers power plants in those 9 states. They auction all of their allowances, 100% auction, and they take all that, most of that money, it's up to each state, but most of that money goes into energy efficiency programs. The European Union has an international program, 31 countries participating, and then the Western Climate Initiative, and maybe China. Okay, my last slide. Colorado, okay, we'll talk a little bit more about Colorado. What might all this mean for Colorado? Last month, Governor Hickenlooper joined a number of other governors after President Trump announced that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Accord. I understand that Nicaragua recently signed on, leaving Syria as the only country in the world that isn't signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement. And so he said that Colorado's going to do this. We're going to hit that Paris target in Colorado, 26% reduction below 2005 levels by 2025. Here's where we are in Colorado. Colorado's a high-growth state. We got a lot of oil and gas. We got huge transportation emissions. We've got a lot of coal. It's a great state. You know what? We've got a real challenge. If we're going to turn this corner and start driving emissions down like that, we have a lot of progress coming in the electricity sector here. There's a lot of coal plants retiring. There's a lot of clean energy coming on. But we're not going to get there, I would suggest, without something like a carbon tax or cap and trade program. Thank you. I was supposed to hook you up there. Sorry. Steve, help.
Oh, I got to do this thing.
Here, I think we got to escape maybe, and then
There we go.
and then you're down here somewhere. You got it? Yeah, I'm not an economist. No. Let's see, you got it. If you just hit right, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It is an honor to be here with Patrick and Steve and Trish and all of you. So I get to talk about carbon taxes. I like to start with this slide. So this is kind of all my presentation of everything you need to know about climate change in just a couple of slides. We start off with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts it. This is primarily due to human activity, principally burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations in the atmosphere go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. They laughed at that joke more in Texas. It actually goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is actually still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about floods and droughts and sea level rise and extreme weathers events. In any case, we have been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are measures of global average temperatures for individual years. The red bars are 10-year averages from the 1880s up to the 1970s. And then there's the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the first part of this decade. Temperatures, I would argue, going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, no, you're in the right. You're in the wrong place. It's funny. If you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And that common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation, innovation, development of new technologies, all the things that I, at least as an economist, love about capitalism, which is why I like to wear this shirt. I am a comedian. It's my Enjoy Capitalism t-shirt, made in China. In any case, there are a couple of, the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. We're going to get market forces working to reduce carbon emissions. And whatever you think about capitalism, you may love it, you may hate it, we should all be able to acknowledge that capitalism is a very powerful force in the world. And what I work on as an environmental economist is sort of using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Now, this is generally the part when I do comedy talks that this is the part where people stop laughing because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies, moving beyond just the main benefit of potentially saving the world. There's a side benefit, and the side benefit is if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of things with that revenue. Patrick mentioned some of those earlier. The idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform, tax shifting, revenue neutral tax swaps. The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like carbon emissions, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. This is an idea that has support from economists kind of across the political spectrum, and there's even a place that's done this. So in the eyes of many economists, the best climate policy in the world is in the Canadian province of British Columbia, which in 2008 had a right-of-center government that said, hey, we want to do something about climate change, we want to be market-friendly, we don't want to grow government. So they implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Carbon tax is $30 per ton of CO2. It's about 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. It's a pretty significant carbon tax, but the carbon tax is offset, in fact, a little bit more than offset by reductions in personal and corporate income taxes and other tax reductions in the province of British Columbia. Policy's been in place since 2008. It's been quite successful in my view. There's another way to put a price on carbon, which is with a cap and trade system. California is the best example there. I don't want to get too much into the carbon tax versus cap and trade sort of fight, because there is kind of a fight among some climate activists about this, and mostly I think that that's not terribly helpful to a first approximation. Anything you do with one of those policies, you can do with the other. And either of those policies, you can do them well, you can do them badly. In my opinion, getting either one of them in place, a good policy of either form in place would be fabulous. I will, however, tell you why I like the BC approach a little better than the California approach. And it has to do with the fact that the BC approach is very simple and transparent. So simple you can actually describe the whole policy with a haiku. So I'm very proud of this. This is my BC carbon tax haiku. It's a fossil CO2, $30 for each ton, revenue neutral. Now, California's cap and trade system, I would argue, is a little bit more like War and Peace. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, right? War and Peace is generally recognized as one of the best novels ever written. It's just complicated, and I'm a simple economist. I like to keep things simple. In any case, the BC approach policy has been in place since 2008. It has successfully reduced carbon emissions. Here's petroleum product sales per capita. BC is in green. Canada as a whole is in blue. The drop at the very beginning here is the financial crisis. But you can see that carbon emissions in BC have fallen. The economy of BC is doing great. It's really, I think, a shining example of good environmental economics, good climate policy in action. I was the founder and co-chair of the Initiative 732 campaign in Washington State last year. Our policy was sort of inspired by the BC approach with a little bit, some twists to sort of make it work in Washington State. So our policy was a $25 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, going up slowly over time. Most of the revenue went to cut the state sale. Most of the revenue would have gone to cut the state sales tax by a full point. May or may not sound like all that much, but it would be hundreds of dollars a year for an average household in Washington State. Smaller portions went to fund an earned income tax credit benefit for low-income households and to effectively eliminate the existing business tax in Washington State for manufacturers as a way to help them maintain competitiveness with businesses that are outside of the state. So that was our policy. We had a really terrific grassroots group that put it on the ballot, gathered 350,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. We were not supported by any millionaires or billionaires. It was an honest to goodness grassroots effort. Unfortunately, we didn't win. And there's a lot of stories there that we can talk about, but one reason we didn't win was that we were opposed by many environmental groups in Washington State. This is one of my favorite headlines from the Seattle Times. Not this one about the salmon dying because the waters are too hot, and not this one about Arctic drilling rigs, but this one, Green Alliance opposes petition to tax carbon. Happy to talk a little bit more during the discussions about why that might have been, but for the overview, I will refer you to the editorial from the Washington Post titled, "The Left's Opposition to a Carbon Tax Shows There's Something Deeply Wrong with the Left." Yeah, politics is difficult business. So there's an optimistic view about 732 and a pessimistic view. The pessimistic view of 732, again summarized in a haiku, is revenue neutral. It can unite left and right in opposition. The optimistic view of 732 was 41%. That was how much of the vote we got. 41% want bipartisan action, not bad for first try. Part of why I'm here tonight is encourage you all to take a try here in Colorado. I think that states for the next many years are going to be the laboratories of democracy on this issue. I think Colorado is an excellent place, especially since you have ballot measures in Colorado, and especially because Colorado is kind of a purple state, to really try to do something in Colorado that could work as a model for the nation. And this is something that we tried to do in Washington State as well, and that I encourage folks everywhere to work on. So to talk a little bit about Colorado, fossil fuel emissions, roughly 100 million tons of CO2 per year. If you had a tax of $30 per ton of CO2, and again, that's roughly 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, it's roughly 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, half that for natural gas, nothing for wind, solar, hydro, renewables, provides a nice financial incentive for individuals, households, businesses, utilities to move their operations in a more sustainable direction. You'd generate more than $2 billion a year in revenue in the state of Colorado, assuming a 20% reduction in emissions. And that's about $400 per person. Obviously, some of that would get paid by businesses, et cetera. But that $400 is the financial incentive that everybody would face under a carbon price, under a carbon tax in particular, to move their activities, their economic activities in a more sustainable direction. That may sound like a lot of money, but put it in the context of the Colorado state tax system. There are already a lot of taxes in the state of Colorado that you could replace or reduce with carbon tax revenue. Sort of similar to what we did with Initiative 732 in Washington State. So the state income tax brings in $5.5 billion a year. Corporate income tax, almost $1 billion a year. State sales tax brings in $2.4 billion a year. This is 2014 data. So you could, roughly speaking, the state sales tax is 2.9%, as I understand it, the state portion of the sales tax. You could think about cutting that in half. Right? In Washington State, we talked about a 1-point reduction in the state sales tax. So effectively what we're talking about here is, would you pay 10% more for fossil fuels in exchange for paying 1% less for everything else and saving the world? Right? So that's the kind of idea that I want you to think about. Patrick obviously talked about other things you could do with carbon pricing revenue, but it is a pile of money. Right? And I personally, my view is that if we're going to make action on climate change, it's going to have to get some bipartisan support. And I have a hard time seeing folks on the right side of the political spectrum voting for something that's going to generate a huge additional pile of money for government activities. I could be wrong about that. So if we look at Colorado emissions, we compare per capita emissions in Colorado, which is in the middle here, with per capita emissions in the United States. You'll see Colorado almost matches the United States perfectly. Okay, and then here's percentages of the total in Colorado. So, transportation is 31%, electric power 41%. This is 2014 data, so as Patrick mentioned, some of that electricity has come down a little bit. Transportation has become somewhat more important. Transportation issues, pretty interesting in Colorado. It's about a third of emissions, $250 million a year. There's a piece of the state constitution that says that the proceeds from any excise tax on gasoline shall be used exclusively for public highways. About half of the states have similar measures in the state constitution, basically dedicating tax revenue from motor vehicle fuels into the state highway fund. I think the Colorado Constitution also says something similar about aircraft fuel, that taxes on aircraft fuel have to be used for the benefit of airports and stuff like that. So that's an interesting, certainly something that you have to think about when it comes to carbon taxes in the state of Colorado. It may or may not be something to think about when it comes to cap and trade systems. What I note is that in British Columbia, for example, they actually have successfully reduced transportation sector emissions. Per capita fuel demand is down by 7%, and fuel efficiency of the vehicle fleet is up by 4% in BC compared to what it would have been without the BC carbon tax. And the case that I will make to you is that climate change is an important enough issue and carbon pricing is an important enough tool that it would be worth it to say, hey, let's have a carbon tax in Colorado and let's take a third of the revenue and put it into the highway fund, as required by the state constitution. Part of why I say that is that I think you could expand the political constituency to support a measure like that, potentially to include a significant portion of the business community who, as I understand it, I'm an outsider in Colorado, as I understand it, there's a bunch of folks on the Front Range who are desperate for transportation funds, and maybe even some people around here who would also like to not have huge potholes in the roads all the time. So I think thinking about those political constituency issues, I think, are quite important. But if you are going to do a carbon tax in the state of Colorado, this would be an important thing to talk to your legal team about. But I don't think it's necessarily an insurmountable obstacle, and I think you might even be able to build sort of a clean the air, fix the roads kind of coalition that could bring environmentalists and the business community together on a policy like that. You'd still have, even if you put a third of the money into the transportation fund, you'd still have 2/3 of the money that you could use to cut the state sales tax by a full point, to do a dividend system, to fund clean energy, whatever it is that you might wish to do with that revenue. This was an article from the Denver Post from a while ago about the political mood and the challenge of funding transportation infrastructure in this state, especially given increases in vehicle fuel economy, and potentially declining tax revenue from the existing gas tax. I want to include this slide just to show how powerful carbon taxes are. They're not, a 4 or 7% reduction in carbon emissions from the transportation sector may not seem like all that much, but if you look at the electricity sector, a $25 carbon tax like what we were working on in Washington State, or a $30 carbon tax like what British Columbia has, that is an incredibly powerful driver in the electricity sector. This is a model from the Energy Information Administration, U.S. government agency, looking at power sector emissions, so electricity sector emissions, which are between 1/3 and 1/2 of U.S. carbon emissions. The dark line here at the top is business as usual, and this green line here at the bottom is their estimate of national electricity sector emissions under a policy that would essentially be a national version of the Initiative 732 policy in Washington State, a carbon tax of $25 per ton of CO2 going up slowly over time. Incredible, powerful, game-changing reductions in electricity sector emissions. That is how to get a hold of me. If you have more questions after the evening is over, and since I finished ahead of my time schedule, Patrick, I will plug my books, which I brought here for sale if anybody's interested. A couple cartoon books about economics and a cartoon book about climate change. Actually, all three of the books talk about carbon issues. Happy to tell them if anybody's interested in engaging in capitalism tonight. And with that, I thank you very much for including me on this panel.
Okay, yes. I think Mitch is turning this one on. So we're going to move into a panel discussion here and ask questions for the next, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions that I will randomly select from the cards that I have here. Let me turn the light on. Is this-
Gold mics.
Should be good. Thanks, Mitch. Okay. This first question is basically going to be similar for Yoram and Patrick. But Yoram, I'm going to ask you first. What have been the biggest lessons learned from the attempt to pass carbon tax legislation in the state of Washington last November, and how would they apply to Colorado?
That's a fine question. I'm glad you fed it to me early because I have a long list here of them. It turns out that when you run a ballot measure campaign, you learn a lot. I will rattle off just a couple of the lessons that we learned. I mean, lesson number one, which we probably already know, is that climate action is hard. I mean, the fundamental problem with climate action is that the vast majority, I take that back. The fundamental problem is that not enough people in this country care as much as I think they ought to about climate change. Right? So that's lesson number one. It's very hard. Lesson number two is that carbon pricing is extra hard. People don't get economics. People don't like economics. When I say people, I mean voters. They're very hesitant about anything that has to do with taxes or money coming out of their pocket. So that's an extra challenge for this policy, and I wouldn't work on a carbon pricing policy if I didn't think it was so incredibly important as a way to reduce carbon emissions. Lesson number three, I think, is that there's hope on the right. We didn't do great with voters from the right side of the political spectrum, but we did end up getting some pretty good endorsements. We got an endorsement from former Senator Slade Gordon. We got an endorsement from Rob McKenna, who narrowly lost the governor's race in 2012. We got endorsements from 3 sitting state Republican legislators, state senators. So I think there's some hope on the right side of the political spectrum, and I spent a lot of my time working with fellow conservatives to push for climate action in a smart, market-friendly kind of way. Lesson number 4 is that there are challenges on the left. We were opposed by the Sierra Club. We were opposed by Washington conservation voters. The one major environmental group that supported Initiative 732, in other words, fulfilled what their mission statement might be, is the Audubon Society. I give huge props to Audubon Society. But there are challenges on the left. That has to do with lesson number 5, which is that ultimately a lot of this is about revenue. The more time I spend working on climate policy, the less I think of it as climate policy, and the more I think of it as fiscal policy. You're talking about a large amount of money, and what people care about is who pays the money and who gets the money. The opposition from the left was in large part because there were constituencies on the left who wanted money for their things. And climate action was not important enough for them to say, I'm going to set that aside. The next lesson, I guess, is that, we got 41% of the vote, and you can think of 41% as kind of a floor for carbon policy. We got 41% of the vote despite being opposed by just about everybody. And there's an optimistic take on that, which says, look, like next time somebody can do it better, and maybe it'll be some of the environmental groups who opposed us. They're working on a ballot measure for 2018, supposedly, and for the most part, I wish them luck. So I think there's possibilities there. I do think it would help if people focused on preferences rather than principles. So everybody has their favorite idea of what to do, how to implement a carbon policy. Is it a cap and trade? Is it carbon tax? Is it fee and dividend? Is it money for clean energy investments? I think it's fine to advance your preferences. I think you step over a line, a pretty dangerous line in my view, when you say, oh, these are our principles and we're going to oppose things that are not in line with what we are, with what our particular vision of the world is going to be. And the last thing I'll say, and this is what I encourage, our opposition, our erstwhile left-wing opposition in Washington State to do, I encourage everybody to take a swing at the ball. Right? The way that we're going to get climate policy passed is by trying stuff and seeing what works. And the states are the laboratories of democracy. That's why I encourage you all to run a ballot measure here in Colorado. That's why I encouraged our opponents in Washington State to run a ballot measure in 2018, which supposedly they're going to do. You know, keep trying things, because if we don't do anything, that's not going to work either. The end.
All right, thank you. Patrick, similar question. What are the biggest lessons learned in California in the cap and trade program there, and how do they apply to Colorado?
So my first one is the same, first one that Yoram had on his list, which is this is hard. A lot of talk about California, but the Western Climate Initiative started in 2008 with 5 Western governors signed on. And it was led by a Republican, Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? He is and was a Republican. The governors of Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And they were quickly joined by the governor of Utah, John Huntsman, as well as the governor of Montana, and the premiers of 4 Canadian provinces, British Columbia, who defected, British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, and Ontario. Okay, so after, and it is complicated, but all those jurisdictions were participants in designing the program and developing the program roughly from 2008 to 2011. And then for a variety of reasons, the only state of those 7 left standing was California. And the only province of those 4 that was left standing was Quebec. So it is challenging. And the commitment, I mean, there's 2 things really. One is that the commitment on the part of the political leadership in the state, the governor, is critically important. We lost Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico all when the governors changed. And Washington and Oregon, the other piece of this that's very challenging is that governors are weak in many respects. We have sort of a weak governor system. They need the state legislature. And Washington and Oregon have continued to try to get this passed through their state legislatures. They've had a succession of governors that have supported the program, but can't get the authority through their state legislatures. So, and then the other thing is that it is complicated. I cannot deny the War and Peace piece of this, but it has been figured out, and it is working. And California did not, after several years of implementation, they did not walk away from the program. They doubled down on it. In Ontario, after studying it and considering it for years, has now officially signed on. And so, yes, it is difficult, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the aspects and pros and cons of carbon tax versus cap and trade. But while it is complicated, I think the lesson learned is that we know how to do it.
Okay. Yoram, you mentioned a $30 a ton carbon tax, and that it would have basically a huge impact on emissions from the electricity sector. I think what that would mean would basically it would kill coal. But it would also have a very modest impact on the transportation sector. It doesn't seem like it would make much difference. Can you tell me what that would tell you?
Sure. So again, a $30 carbon tax. These are rough mnemonics, but they're handy to keep in mind. $30 per ton of CO2 carbon tax is roughly 3 cents. Excuse me. It's roughly 30 cents a gallon of gasoline and other motor fuels, and it's roughly 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. Half that for natural gas. Nothing for wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, renewables. So a $30 carbon tax would have a huge impact on the electricity sector. It would have a relatively small impact on the transportation sector. You know, price of gasoline fluctuates by 50 cents or $1 a gallon with some regularity. My take on that as an economist is that the low-hanging fruit is in the electricity sector. That's what you should focus on. And leave the transportation sector for another day.
Patrick, same question. What does that mean? What does that tell you?
So I do agree, and in fact, kind of preparing for this talk, I learned a little bit more about how a carbon tax would affect the electricity sector. And I totally agree that it would have a very significant impact on our electricity mix. And one of the reasons for that is that there are alternatives, right? Like, we can generate electricity in a lot of different ways. And coal is already very much on the margin. As you know, there are a lot of coal plants retiring now, existing coal plants that are retiring because they are not cost competitive in the current electricity market in the western United States. And so if you burden those sources with a carbon tax, which at $30 a ton is it's not insignificant. California allowances are currently at about $15 a ton. This price cap that I was talking about for the next phase of the program, they haven't decided yet, but they're kicking around $60 a ton. So a $30 a ton carbon tax is well within the range of what people talk about. But if you put that on coal, that is already not competitive in many cases, and where there are alternatives, either natural gas or renewable energy, I have no reason to doubt that it would have the impact that we saw. From my perspective, I'm about emissions. I'm about tons, and how we've improved air quality and how we're going to address climate change it's the absolute number of tons that go up in the air. And we need a much bigger lever for transportation. And we were talking earlier today, electric vehicles are coming. I mean, there's very little doubt that we are going to be transitioning off of gasoline-powered cars into electric vehicles. The real question from an emissions standpoint is how rapidly we do that. And so do we just kind of let that transition play out over 20 or 30 years, or do we take action now, either by aggressively regulating emissions under a cap and trade program, or by having mandates for electric vehicle sales, or dramatically increasing the corporate average fuel economy standards, the federal standards for fuel economy. That is, my concern really is that, yes, it could work very well for electricity, but we need a bigger lever for transportation.
And you're saying that not just for carbon taxes, but also for cap and trade also.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, right. The 40% by 2030 is on the path to 80% by 2050.
Let me say, so one of the issues that I think you'll see on the table in the discussion about carbon taxes and cap and trade is like, what's a good sign of success? And Patrick likes to talk about emissions reductions and hitting emissions reductions targets. I don't think about that way really as an economist. I think about hitting price points. I think about hitting carbon tax levels, or the equivalent of carbon tax levels from a cap and trade system. And let me tell you why I think that way. The climate challenge is not going to be solved in Colorado. Right? The climate challenge is not going to be solved in the United States. If you look at the century ahead of us, the climate challenge is going to be dealt with in India and China and Africa and the developing countries of the world, right? Which are China's already almost double U.S. emissions, I think. Right? So what we really need to do, in my view, the best story I can tell you about how we get out of this climate challenge that we're in is if we can come up with innovative technologies that China and India will adopt, not necessarily because they're green, but because they're cheaper than fossil fuels. If we can get to that point, then I will give humanity like a B+. Right? If we can get to that point like by mid-century, if we can get to that point by mid-century, then I will give humanity a B+ at dealing with climate change. Okay? And I think that the best way to get those innovations is to push the private sector, the free market economy, to work on technological innovations, to get the next Elon Musk out there, to get the current Elon Musk out there, right? And get him more venture capital for all of the, those great ideas. And the way to do that is with a price on carbon. Right? That's why I target the price. So ultimately, I agree, in the long term, it's going to be a question about, okay, what's the quantity and did we drive down emissions enough? But I see much more important, I see what is that price and is it driving private sector innovation?
But don't you think that...
No.
Don't you think that an aggressive cap that requires a shift would also drive innovation, as you've described?
Absolutely, but the way I would measure an aggressive cap is by looking at the price that it generates. I mean, the way that I judge a cap and trade system is not by, okay, did we meet the targets that we set? Because who knows what targets you set, and who knows what might happen. If in British Columbia, let's take an example. British Columbia has targets. Patrick tells me they're not going to meet their targets, but partly that's because British Columbia discovered a whole lot of natural gas. Okay, now if you happen to think that British Columbia should have not developed their natural gas fields, fine. Right? I think that we should set that price target, and that's how I'm going to judge the success of your policy, is by whether or not you're actually hitting that price target, whether it's through a carbon tax directly or whether it's through a permit price from a cap and trade system. Because when I look at a cap and trade system like the European emissions trading system that has a permit price of $3 or $4 per ton of CO2, I think that's a very weak price signal. I think that's a relatively ineffective policy.
Well, and I agree with it.
I'm going to introduce...
Well, I need to say one more thing. And mainly that I agree with what Yoram just said. We have really been in the early phases of cap and trade, and the prices are low. California's at about $15 a ton right now. WCI, it's the same price across the Canadian provinces as well. We're going to see where it goes here between now and 2030, because Quebec and Ontario have adopted the same target of 40% below. So in relatively short order, and as soon as California passed that legislation, the price jumped. And so I think we are certainly heading to higher prices under the cap and trade program. And the European system, there's a lot to be said about that. But I think under the WCI program, we are going to see that price increase.
Okay, well, let's move on. That was a good one. Thank you. One last question, and then we're going to get to a question from the basket here. And it'll be the same question to both of you as well. Since we're really talking about what's possible in Colorado, that really we need to talk a little bit about politics. So in terms of politics of these two policy instruments, and I'll let you talk specifically about the policy instrument that you spoke about, what do you think is possible in Colorado, thinking about the politics? Patrick, why don't you take that one first?
Well, to some extent, I think we've already answered. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. We'll see. I think Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado he set a marker, and in doing so, he opened the door. There was a report that came out just a couple days ago. Lisa's here from Conservation Colorado, and they, along with the Western Resource Advocates, a great group that works out of Boulder, issued a report about how Colorado could meet those targets. It included either a cap and trade or a carbon tax as necessary to hit that target, not surprisingly. So I think Governor Hickenlooper has opened the door. Obviously, he's only got another year in office. I think that it's important that not only in Colorado, but in other western states, there's going to be a lot of new governors across the West and across the country. And as Yoram said, this is going to be something that is in the state's lap for the coming years. That this issue become important in the governor's races. What happens with the Colorado State Legislature right now? you know, the sad thing really is how polarized this issue has become. And so we'll see. You're going to need a flip. We're going to need to flip the Colorado State Senate if anything's going to happen there through the legislature. We're going to need a governor that is really committed to this, and because it's very difficult. And I think that, you know, I'm very supportive of what he was saying about taking a swing, you know, the idea of a ballot initiative, get a good question out there and see where people are going, I think could be a very important next step.
Yoram, what are your thoughts?
Two thoughts on what's politically possible. One is that, I mean, one of the challenges is there's a huge gulf between what we need to accomplish and what we seem to be politically capable of. Having said that, and based on the experience that I had with my colleagues in Washington State, which was really, I mean, it was you know, one of the highlights of my life to be able to be involved in this campaign. You know, I think it's worth keeping in mind, like the rule of politics is, you know, that everything's impossible until it happens. And I think there's a tremendous amount that you can gain by trying stuff. And personally, I'm a big fan of ballot measures because I like the idea of, hey, let's put something before the voters of this state and let's talk to people. I know that what I've learned about in Durango is there's a difference between folks in the city and folks in the surrounding county in terms of political affiliations and preferences. But get out and you know, talk to your neighbors, talk to folks you know, in different places. And I think at the very least what that does, if you run a ballot measure in Colorado like we did in Washington State, you will show that climate change is an important issue to you, important enough that you have gone out and stood on the street corners and gathered signatures, important enough that you've made donations, important enough that you've reached out to talk to people and say, hey, you know, neighbor, this is something that's important to me, and I just want to tell you why this is important to me, and I want to get your thoughts on that. So I don't know whether you can win a ballot measure in Colorado, whether it's cap and trade, whether it's carbon tax, but I don't see any reason why you shouldn't try. And I hope you do. Yeah.
Okay, let's spend the next 10 minutes or so getting some questions. And these are three people I just kind of drew at random out of the basket here. I'd like to queue up behind the mic. They're three familiar names to me. Kirby McLaurin, Andrew Zeller, and Rachel Landis. Those will be the first three that queue up in that order, please. Kirby, Andrew, and Rachel. And go ahead, 15 seconds to get your question out.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. I'm Kirby McLaurin. I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm curious, of course, what your opinion is of our carbon fee and dividend proposal, given the highly partisan political climate we have as a likely vehicle that might get passed. I was also wondering, are your presentations available online? And where will we go?
If
You
they're
can
on,
have mine. We can get it to you. Yeah, we'll get it to you, yeah.
My joke about War and Peace is proprietary, but you can have the rest of it. Sure. So for those of you who don't know Citizens Climate Lobby, my guess is that most of you do. Citizens Climate Lobby is an awesome grassroots group that across the nation that works on a fee and dividend proposal. I prefer to call it a carbon tax. CCL calls it a carbon fee. That's fine. It's a fee, and then the money gets dividended, so everybody gets a check every year like the Alaska Permanent Fund. I'll give you an answer as my economist answer to what I think about the CCL policy is that I think it's a strong climate policy. I think that there are some reasons why economists tend to favor tax reductions over dividends, essentially having to do with the deadweight loss, the costs of taxes to the economic system and the distortions that they create. But I'll also say, for example, that the dividend approach that CCL does is much more progressive than almost any kind of tax reduction policy that you could put out there. I will put on the table a potential political challenge with the CCL approach, which is that you have to make a determination, and as far as I know, CCL hasn't done this yet, about whether undocumented residents will get the dividend. I think that's a very difficult political question to answer because there are challenges either way on that. The last thing I'll say about CCL is, I love that they're engaged in a positive way, advancing a positive vision of their policy. I think that other groups, especially the groups that opposed Initiative 732 last year in Washington State, would benefit from looking at that positive vision model of Citizens Climate Lobby. I do think that it's going to take considerably longer to pass national legislation than CCL thinks, and obviously than we would all like. And so we had a very positive experience with CCL groups in Washington State, where essentially my take on it was a lot of people in Washington State and CCL groups had already done the CCL things. Like, they'd already written letters to the editor, they'd written op-eds, they met with their congressperson, and they were looking for other ways to get involved in climate action. And they got plugged into the 732 campaign. CCL ultimately endorsed the campaign, and we had a really great collaboration. So I would hope that CCL is going to continue to do those sorts of collaborations with state-level activities without losing sight of their ultimate goal of passing national fee and dividend legislation.
Andrew.
I'll say just mainly that I think that was a great response, and I agree with that. And I do think that the way that Citizens Climate Lobby has gotten out there and educated people in the grassroots nature and the national nature, of the program. My friend's dad in Indiana wanted to talk to me about it because he's working on it there. So I think that's it's quite remarkable what's been accomplished on that. It's challenging to get a policy like that passed, certainly through the U.S. Congress, but it goes to what we were saying, is that, well, I'm a hockey fan, so I'll use the Wayne Gretzky analogy. You miss 100% of the shots that you never take. So there you go.
So you got another CCL person here. You both, I believe, mentioned revenue neutral in terms of the policies that you advocated. Is that correct?
No.
No, you didn't.
For me, no.
Okay. At any rate, with the money going into the government then, Yoram, as a revenue neutral policy, it seems to me that the fact that the dividend going out, and it is monthly actually, would be an easier sell for both sides of the aisle and the populace in general than calling it revenue neutral and having the money going back into the government. People don't see that same level of revenue neutrality. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I think everything's possible. So I think it's possible that the dividend approach is the way to go. One of the challenges in Washington State, for example, is we came very close to being revenue neutral, but we didn't exactly hit 100% revenue neutral because our policy was we have a carbon tax, we're going to cut the sales tax by a point, and so who knows what's going to happen with Boeing and Amazon and population growth in Washington State and all kinds of things like that. So we ended up being plus or minus 1% of state government revenue. Unfortunately for us, in terms of the opinion of folks on the left side of the political spectrum, we were minus a little bit percentage-wise in terms of the impact of 732 on state government revenue. Minus a small percentage turns out to be a lot of money when you actually think about it in dollar terms. It was roughly $800 million revenue negative over 6 years. Keep in mind that the state budget over 6 years is $120 billion. So not a big deal, I would argue, as an economist in the grand scheme of things, but a great talking point for folks on the environmental left who wanted to oppose our policy. And they did that. And it's possible that a dividend approach could get around challenges like that. Ultimately, it is a question to be determined by polling and by trying stuff. So, in Washington State, one reason why we didn't do a dividend was that there's an element in the Washington State Constitution that I think means that you can't do dividends in Washington State. In Colorado, as far as I know, you could do dividends. So my advice to you is to run a ballot measure in Colorado and do dividends. And God bless you and good luck.
Yeah, and just to be clear, when I said no, I was just saying that that was not what I was advocating or describing. But, you know, honestly, and I don't want to be too cavalier about this, but under a cap and trade program, and because I'm an air pollution control guy, what I care about is the emissions. Honestly, I don't care what you do with the money. Because the cap ensures that you hit the emission targets, okay? Now, you do have to, the state and the voters and the legislature primarily is really who's going to decide what to do with the money. And, you know, revenue neutral or dividend, those are perfectly fine things to do with the money. And many of my colleagues, even in cap and trade, think that's the best way to go. What we have seen is that the jurisdictions that have done this and created these significant revenue sources have largely chosen to take that money and to use it for incentivizing the transition one way or another. And I just, so I think it could be a mix. It doesn't have to be, you know, all of one or all of the other. I do think that we have very substantial investment and infrastructure needs. I mean, we know that we already have very significant investment and infrastructure needs in this country. And if we're going to transition to a new energy system, fundamentally, there's going to be a lot more investment and infrastructure needed. And I think, as well as potentially research and development. So I think there are, you know, I will even admit that you got to be a little leery when you throw $20 billion in front of a state legislature or any group of politicians that money is going to get used wisely. But I do think there are some very important and helpful things that could be done with that money, as opposed to just the dividend. But again, I'm sort of agnostic on that, and I know that these other options are good too.
Well, Yoram, you wanted to say something else, but I'm gonna try to stay true to what we told people. Unfortunately, we'll only have a question. Rachel, you'll be the last one to ask a question. Then we'll have some kind of final comments from both Yoram and Patrick.
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Are you a CCL?
Affiliate.
Rachel, tell us what you do, Rachel, because it's awesome.
I'm a ski patroller at Telluride Ski and Golf.
Jealous.
I run a nonprofit for high school girls called San Juan Mountain Souls. I work here at the college and run the environmental center with Marty. Actually, we run it. I don't run it, or it runs us. And then just got myself elected to our electric utility cooperative board. No clapping. But I guess a three-part question. So in Colorado, based on your appraisal of things, you mentioned that
One question, please.
it's all linked.
Let her go.
But no, so you mentioned that governor states can be weak. So in Colorado, is the right mechanism through the governor and the legislature, or is it a ballot initiative? And then based on that, in your appraisal, like what's got the most political will or the easiest thing to get through, cap and trade versus a tax? And then I think on the latter, you mentioned that the left really pushed back on the tax, and you're focusing in on this pricing, or the kind of, they didn't get a piece of a pie. I can't imagine it's that simple, but not to critique you at all. I'm just curious if you've got tips for us so that we don't encounter the same thing. Thanks.
Well, I'll take a crack at that first. I mean, there's no real answer to any of that, I guess, in some ways. Colorado's a tough state. The state legislature, we are a purple state. And so getting something through the state legislature at this point, I think, is a non-starter. Now, we'll see what happens in 2018. If the balance of the state legislature changes and we have a governor who is strongly behind this, my boss, every time he gets introduced, they say that he passed 57 energy bills while in office, a 30% renewable portfolio standard for Colorado, the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act. So we know that you can get stuff through the legislature under the right circumstances, but it's difficult. This is really personal, and I want to clarify that, and not professional. I love the ballot idea in this state right now. I think that, you know, there's so many benefits from it, even if it doesn't pass. So there you go. The carbon tax versus cap and trade. You know, we have this Tabor restriction in Colorado. Didn't you announce a Tabor workshop? We should all go to that. Absolutely, because I don't know, you know, but it makes doing anything with taxes very difficult. So I think that is completely separate from anything having to do with the relative merits. And quite frankly, we could run up against that with cap and trade as well. That was one of the major challenges in California. Was there was a lawsuit by the California Chamber of Commerce saying that what the state was doing with the cap and trade program was a tax, and that was working its way through the legal system. You would almost certainly get a similar legal challenge in Colorado to that. And that's why the 2/3 vote in California was so important. And the third question was?
How to keep us unified.
Yeah.
Well, I'm clearly a unifier, so let me answer that question. I don't believe in unification. And let me tell you why. So in Washington State, here's I think the lesson. In Washington State, the group that I was involved with, Carbon Washington, started out with zero money. It was led by a comedian. You know, we weren't the establishment environmental groups. How is it possible that we got on the ballot? Right? And the answer is really that people, the grassroots climate activists, were tired of nothing happening. They were tired of it. And the reason why nothing happened was because the method that the establishment groups worked on and are still working on was like this grand unified theory where they would get everybody together in a room and then try to come up with a policy that everybody liked. Well, that was 8 years ago, and they're still working on it. Right? So what we did was we said, hey, here's a policy that we like. Let's go find people who support it. And that's what I'd encourage you to do. Find a policy that you love, that you think makes sense. Talk to a couple of economists maybe and make sure that it's not wacky. And then run with it. And there are enough people out there. I think one of the lessons from Washington State is there are enough people out there who care passionately about climate action that they will make it happen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just allow Patrick and Yoram to give us any closing comments that they might have, and then we'll close the event for the evening.
He probably needs to take a breath unless you want to just keep rolling.
I got a head of steam going. I'll keep going. First of all, you also run a ballot measure in Colorado. I've not been clear about that. Second of all, I'm happy to serve as if you need a focal point, send me an email. I'll connect you with each other, and you can go off and do it. I think that would be awesome. I think I want to add one other piece of advice, which is you got to develop a tough skin, right? Which you probably did because you were in a political campaign. But just to give one example of what happened in Washington State, the League of Women Voters was asked to endorse Initiative 732. The climate subcommittee of the League of Women Voters decided that they would recommend to the executive committee to endorse 732, and in response, they were called racists. And I was called a racist, for not listening to the people of color. And so you gotta have a tough skin because politics is a tough business. And if you want to make something happen, then you gotta be prepared to deal with the flack that's going to come your way. The other thing that I wanted to say before I built up that head of steam was, carbon taxes and cap and trade systems are a lot more similar than they are different. They're both market-based mechanisms. They can both effectively reduce carbon emissions if you do them well. So I don't think we should spend our time fighting about, hey, my policy is better than your policy. I think that it's really time to, as I like to say, stop writing and start fighting. Right? So stop saying here's my ideal of how this would work and start actually trying to make stuff happen. Go get signatures, put stuff on the ballot. Good luck. Let's do it.
just not fair to have to follow, you know. First of all, he's funny, and he really is. We got a little. Steve and Deb had some folks over last night, and we got an actual rendition of his stand-up routine. And it is good. And his books, while they are cartoons, are serious. And I'm reading it. I'm learning. You know, it's good. And maybe that's my closing remark. You know, it's just that
Buy my book.
buy his book. Definitely buy his book. Come to Four Course fundraiser a week from Friday at the Durango Arts Center. The Solar Gods and Goddesses. Lori is here. She's the executive director. And is doing a great job on putting on a fun event there, and then the solar home tour the following Saturday. But, you know, thank you for being here. Honestly, that's my closing remark. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I know many of you are active on this issue in a lot of different ways. We've got a tough road, but I'm trying to stay optimistic, and I'm more optimistic tonight after this event, so thank you. And thank you.
All right, thank you.